Hiya, and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm speaking with Henry Lamprecht from the Community Communications Partnership. We're talking about community engagement, consultation, planning committees, some of the difficulties of dealing with planning committees and getting planning, and basically what needs to be done, hopefully, to help get more good quality homes built. Hiya, and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where we're speaking with Henry Lamprecht from Community Communications Partnership, that helps people get planning permission, amongst many other things. Henry, thanks for coming.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much for having me.
Okie dokie. Well, before we get started, perhaps tell me a little bit about how you got started and what Community Communications Partnership does.
Well, I used to be a councillor. I sat on a planning committee. I had a position where we had to make decisions about planning and regeneration. And from that experience that I had working with communities, and I really did work with my communities, to get that buy-in from locals is so important. And when I started out as a councillor, I had absolutely no idea about planning legislation. Nothing. Knew absolutely nothing. And I was given about half an hour's training by the head of planning, and then I was into my first planning committee meeting. And I had very little grasp of what the planning policies were at the local council. I had to educate myself. And I read all this stuff. I actually read my papers, unlike many councillors possibly. And it was gobbledygook. And then, of course, you don't have that technical background. You read those technical reports, and you're left completely befuddled by the end of it. And because of that, I started, when I first got on the planning committee, making decisions based on what residents told me. And also, you measure as a councillor, you measure the importance of something by the content of your mailbag. That's how long ago it was. It's now probably the inbox. And that gave you an idea. And you did listen to residents because, the policies that you read made absolutely no sense. So, being passionate about it, I represented an area of North London where, sadly, the 21st of July bombs were built. It was a very rundown council estate. It had stopped functioning as a community. And it had become kind of a repository for people that was on the temporary housing list. So there was no community cohesion there, or very little. So something had to be done, and we launched a very big regeneration. And
So this was an estate regeneration project, was it? Yeah.
Estate regeneration project. That was the first one that really got me interested. And we went out for a public tender, and then got the three finalists in, and I worked with officers, and we led on this. And I said, well, I'm going to go and get all my members of the community, and I want these three developers to come and do a presentation, and they're going to build models. And then we are going to give them marbles. We're going to put jars in front of the models, and people are going to put a marble in the jar of the one they want. So we took that decision completely to the public, almost on a referendum basis, what the government has been kind of, the previous government had alluded to with kind of neighbourhood referendums. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way across the board, but it certainly worked with this. And if councillors really get involved with that process, they take communities with them. And the community completely formed ownership of this, and they gave some really good input. We had an extension down to a school, 2 forms, went up to 3 forms, new buildings, GP surgery that came in. And again, yes, it's very difficult to provide a new GP surgery. The reality is that you probably can't. There's no money for this. But what you can do is you can actually work with a GP surgery that's perhaps in old or constrained accommodation, and then actually move them into new accommodation. And it's much easier to grow a practice than start a new practice. So, we did that, community centres, play areas, and so the list carried on, and all these wonderful things that the community wanted. And it was large, and there was a lot of people that had to move out of their properties, and we worked with them. I worked very intensely with them, and we used, there's an old GLC scheme that the GLA retained, which is the Countryside and Seaside Living Programme in London. And this basically, again, forms a wonderful solution where people are in accommodation in London that might not be appropriate for them anymore. There's an understanding with places, New Forest is one of them, Eastbourne, where people would then be offered accommodation in other parts. And, I did work with some, particularly some of the older residents who were in accommodation that might have been appropriate when they had children, but now they're rattling around in a 3-4 bedroom property that's underpopulated, while we've got families stuck in 2-bedroom flats with 3-4 children sharing a room. So that's a very nice way of saying to them, well, and there was one particular a couple that I worked very closely in, and they moved to the New Forest, to a beautiful little bungalow which was appropriate for their age. It was a nice community for them to go and slot into, and that freed up their property eventually. So, this really got me into thinking about how planning and property development can shape communities and actually benefit the locals tremendously. So I started to go into this sort of industry, and then worked for somebody else first of all. And then there was a realization at one point that I wanted to do things very differently. And it comes down to our company is a collective of either current or former politicians, senior politicians, all handpicked. It's all people that I handpicked because they share my passion for place shaping, for building community cohesion, and actually getting to that point where communities accept the benefits and working up those benefits, and really understanding what communities are after. So I've got this collective of these wonderful people that I've set up, and we've got representatives from every party. We've got Labour, Lib Dem, Conservatives, and a Green. Probably one of the few places that's got a Green. We've got the former leader of Brighton Hove City Council, Dr. Phelan McCafferty, who works for us. So we bring those insights because, all four of the parties have slightly different views and slightly different priorities in accordance with their ideology. I mean, it's all very close, but there are subtle nuances. So we bring that understanding, facilitate those conversations, and help to educate, our colleagues and former colleagues about how development should work, how development can benefit their communities, make their communities more sustainable, strengthen their communities. So that's the one part. And then the other part of what we do, we obviously do the political conversations, but then what we also do is we do the consultations to take that message that we've worked up and give that voice to the locals, like I did with that community. It's all based on that. Here are the options. We want to hear your views. Let's shape this thing. Let's form this thing. Take ownership of what's happening in your community, because you might want to live there. Your son, your daughter, your grandson, your granddaughter and family might want to go and live there. So many times I've had that conversation where there's people that's, living quite close by. And, if they just hear that there's going to be, 300 houses in the field at the end of their road, there's an immediate knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we don't want this. This is alien. This is something that's being imposed on us. This is somebody coming in from outside, throwing this on our community that's going to disrupt our community. And actually what you need to do is you need to go back and work with these people and actually explain to them the benefits of this development, and also draw their attention to the fact that, yes, they might be living in a 4-bedroom house there, which is possibly now too big for them. There's going to be something smaller here, so they can stay in their community, in a new property that's going to be a lot cheaper to run, free up some capital so that they can go on that cruise that they've always wanted to go on the Queen Mary around the world. And they will have a house in their community. They can stay in their community. They can remain with their GP, their church, their WI, their allotments, their bowls club, whatever is integral to their life. They don't have to transplant themselves completely. And it's bringing people to that sort of thinking. And I'm afraid the old-fashioned way of doing a drop-in exhibition in the village hall, which was the traditional way, it's just not working really. As a councillor, I can tell you, and I still have to meet a councillor that likes these sorts of things, because what you actually facilitate is you invite the councillor showed up, and I know this happened to me when I was a councillor, and you walk in there and there's a group of people that's very angry. And the moment you walk in, you're a target, because they directly come to you and say, we don't want this councillor, you need to fight this councillor. But that makes it very difficult. Developers put us in a very difficult position as councillors, and we don't really want to be in that position. So what we do actually is we take it online, and post the pandemic, everybody can work a smartphone. They had to, otherwise they couldn't go out. We have a QR code, and we also go onto social media. And we produce short little films that explains everything in layman's terms, and work up all these benefits and give people those choices and really meaningful consultation. So not kind of very technical questions. We actually ask them about things that matter to them. What sort of trees do you want planted here? What do you think the park should look like? What sort of play equipment? Really things that people care about, that's going to help to integrate that new community into their community. So that's essentially what we do. We weirdly, because we use a lot of social media, our consultation, the spike in our consultation is usually between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m.
That's when you get a load of most engagement? Between
Yes.
11 p.m. and 1 a.m. in the morning?
Yes.
Oh, really?
And
That must be pissed people.
Well,
But bored, is it?
Well, no. So this is what's interesting. So, we did a bit of research on this, and actually what it is, we all have one of these things, always with us. And what most people do, and you're probably going to laugh now because I suspect you probably do this yourself, you go to bed and you don't read a book anymore. You lie in bed and you scroll through this thing. You go on your social media, because now you're in a mind space of finding out what's going on in the community. What's my friends been up to? What's going on? And you're in that mind space of wanting to find out what's going on. And then, using very clever technology and algorithms and things. I've got very clever young people that do these things. I don't claim to be able to know how these things work, but they can make it work. And they pick these people up, and that's when we engage with people. And these are, I always think my target audience, my ideal target audience for this is the single mother with 3 children in a 3-bedroom home, and 2 boys, Tommy and Jamie, 14 and 12, sharing a bedroom. And they're fighting like cat and dog because they each want their little space now. And the mother's too busy running around between football, karate, ballet, drama classes, whatever. She hasn't got time to engage otherwise during the day. She's certainly not going to take time out to come to a drop-in exhibition. And we need to engage with her because she's that pragmatic demographic who we really want to engage with, but she doesn't. And if she's got time off, she's likely to go to the pub with her mates, not come to a drop-in. So how do we get to her? We get to her on social media, onto a website with a very short little film, drone shots, filmed on the ground. This is what we're planning. In ordinary layman's terms, this is why you should support this. To educate people, to bring them along with that message. So we find that's really quite important, very effective. If people know what's happening and know the plans, they're likely to support it.
Yeah. So there's lots of interesting stuff there. So everywhere is different. Obviously, every site is different. Every opportunity, every community is different. So they need to be, in my opinion, treated differently. One of the biggest problems I think with property developers and property development is people that just think everything's the same and they just decide what they want to do and try to force it on the people and places. Yeah. But, in terms of the sort of demographic of affected people, historically, it's interesting you talk about exhibitions. I've got to tell you, and for a long, long time, exhibitions, in my opinion, as a developer, has been exactly the wrong thing to do because it just, and certainly if you are ever going to do an exhibition, you don't do it at, 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening because all that does is attract a whole load of people at the same time and it turns into a big bun fight. And of course, the people that turn up, and this is a bit of a stereotype, but stereotypes exist for a reason, right? It does tend to be older people, time on their hands, happy or don't like change, and they're all right. Jack, I've already got a nice house. I don't want any change. Whereas the people that really need housing are busy, looking after the kids, working their nuts off, whatever it might be. So I think the good thing in recent years is there are, the whole movement is changing around focusing on people that actually want and need housing and development rather than just the few that are all right already and don't want any change,
Oh, completely. The analogy I use with this, again, we bring a lot of stuff out from marketing. The first thing you need to do when you do any form of consultation is forget about all the technical jargon because that just puts people off. Nobody lives in a dwelling, but that's the term you have to use technically for your planning application. But if you talk about 95 dwellings to the ordinary man on the street, they'll just look at you and like you're mad.
Yeah.
The analogy I use with this is the John Lewis analogy. Sorry, I'm not allowed. Am I allowed to say John Lewis?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, not free advertising. You might cut this out. The John Lewis analogy. If you go to John Lewis and you buy a toaster from John Lewis and you take it home and you put the toaster on and catches fire and your kitchen burns down, your house burns down, that next morning you are at John Lewis's front door. Mr. Lewis, I want my money back. You're going to buy me a new house. Because you're motivated, because there's something negative that's happened, and that's a natural human instinct. Something happens that's negative, you are going to complain about it, you are going to make a noise about it. However, if you buy that toaster and, you take it home and it makes perfectly nice golden brown toast, so what? You're not going to go and, no, Mr. Lewis, I'd just like to thank you for this wonderful toaster that you sold me. It doesn't happen. That's just not human nature. And that's what needs to happen is you need to have that mindset. Ultimately, humans are quite selfish creatures. We all want to look out for ourselves. And you've got to give people that reason. What is in this for me? And how do you keep people happy? And finding those people, it's that customer service approach. Can I just ask you about your toaster that you bought? Didn't it make lovely toast? Yes, thank you. Good. Can you give us, a line saying this was a lovely toaster? That marketing principle, 5 stars review. Yes, great toaster makes lovely toast. It's bringing that element in. And also when you communicate the message about the housing, go back to simple principles of marketing. What's this house going to look like? Don't talk in abstracts. And that will actually bring us on later in the conversation, I'm sure, to what the new NPPF and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is suggesting about local plans and outline planning permission and things like that. Don't talk in abstracts. People don't understand abstracts. When I was a councillor, for the first at least 3 planning committee meetings, I had no idea what was the difference between an outline planning application and a reserved matters planning application. And if I didn't, I can guarantee you that the ordinary Joe on the street would have no idea. You want to build some houses. So you've got to think about your audience when you talk about this messaging. And that's where it all goes wrong, if you forget who your audience is.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Let's. So I suppose when it comes to getting or negotiating planning permission, from my point of view, from a developer's point of view, right? I want to do good stuff. I want to build some nice homes for people. But of course, I've got a number of, let's call them stakeholders and people that I need to get on board. So obviously you've got local communities. But then, of course, you've got planning, you've got the planning officers, and then you've got planning committees. And, obviously, if you end up getting refused, you've got the planning inspectorate to deal with. But, hopefully, if you do all of that other stuff the right way, get the committees on board, get the planners on board and conform with policy, that you don't want to end up at appeal if you can help it. But as you've touched upon yourself, the fact that committees generally get pretty much zero training is diabolical, really, isn't it? Well, two things really, in my opinion. Not just no real understanding of planning, but also, and this is even more important, right? And this is one of the reasons I do this. No real understanding of land economics and how that all works.
Absolutely.
Because some of the bullshit I've seen and heard at planning committees, and I'm sure you have as well, and many other people around. They think developers just are all making fortunes, and there's a bottomless pit of cash, and we don't care, and it just amazes me, really. I don't know who they think built the houses that they live in. All of these people.
Yes.
Now, obviously, years ago, local authorities, councils built a lot of housing. They don't really anymore. But the vast majority in this housing in this country was built by developers on land that at one point was a field. But all of a sudden, it's like a bad thing. Like where, I don't know. One of the things that's really not helpful is this whole them and us thing. Like the developers are the bad guys.
Yes, and there's a change in mindset that's necessary. We need to move away from in this country from the mindset that there's housing coming. Oh, it's awful, and start embracing it. And that is and I'm afraid that this is where politics come in. The fact of the matter is that planning has never, ever been more political than it is now. If you go back a few years, the vast majority of councils in this country was run by the Conservative Party. Conservative Party is very strong at that grassroots level. They historically have always been the party of local government. And in urban areas you used to get Labour councils and then, the odd Lib Dem council here and there. And, I think when I was first elected, I think there was 2 Green councillors across the entire country. That's now almost 1,000. The party's grown fantastically. So there's been this kind of, politics has become so fractured in local government. With so many parties and, progressive alliances. I mean, the amount of councils that's run by progressive alliances, that's, kind of a handful of Labour, handful of Lib Dems, handful of Greens and some independents. Or sometimes they're also called as ABC coalitions anything but conservative. And this is just something that's happened over the last few years. And it has caused a huge amount of problem. And that goes back to, the fundamental problem. A lot of councillors, unfortunately, and a lot of political parties have allowed councillors to jump on that campaign bandwagon. Why should you vote for me? Well, an emotive issue to get people to vote for you is to say, well, I will stop these housing. Did you know that there's going to be all this housing coming? This will be, and then of course, the old chestnuts, every house will have at least 3 or 4 cars, and then they make their own calculations, and there's going to be another 1,000 cars on the gridlocked roads. You already can't see your GP for 3 weeks, so this is now going to be 3 months, and the schools are completely full already, and it's all these, you can almost, I call it NIMBY bingo, where you can almost predict all these objections, and a lot of that goes back to irresponsible campaigning by councillors, I'm afraid, and I'm very harsh about this. Housing should not be allowed to be used as campaign tools. There is a collective responsibility to make sure that we address this national housing crisis. And I was absolutely furious last week when I read, and I I'm sure you've read my article, Paul. I know you read my little weekly missives. And I was absolutely furious when I read that there's councils balking at the new housing targets and, immediately dismissing the 1.5 million homes this government wants to deliver as just complete nonsense. This is undeliverable. Well, I'm afraid, if that's the attitude 5 months into a government that's probably going to be in post for 5 years, that's just not the way to do things. I mean, if you haven't got something to aim for in life,
exactly, I agree. It's quite unbelievable, really, and council saying it's impossible, we can never meet those targets and things like that. And it's you
haven't even tried.
You're never going to meet them if you don't try. And in actual fact, trust me, as a developer trying to find sites, get deals to stack up, negotiate with landowners, and actually win planning permission, deal with services, utilities, bill costs, quangos, all of the various other stakeholders and consultees, they think allocating a few houses is difficult. You try being, trust me, the people that have to deliver them. So, yes. and they are effectively, local authorities, planning departments, committees, the gatekeepers, really.
Yes.
And I've got to tell you, in my opinion, and this is the biggest problem with planning and the whole mindset, is, this is a massive crisis. They're acting like the police, where they should actually be acting like the fire and ambulance service,
yes,
trying to solve the crisis, really not stop stuff happening.
That's a really good analogy, that. That is it. They are there to facilitate, not to block. And that is a mindset that needs to change. And to get back to your point earlier about the planning system, we've got wonderful planning consultants and developers who's done degrees in planning and town planning, and has got years of experience. And then you've got your architects, and you've got all your transport consultants and your environmental consultants and daylight and sunlight, and and all these huge numbers of reports that you have to prepare for these applications. And you've got, at some point, I would actually like to just sit down with a developer and do a case study and say, so let's look at your team, the experience that your team that you've paid tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds for. Let's just calculate the numbers of years of experience they've gotten and their degrees and what that costs and everything. They then formulate that planning application that then gets submitted to a planning department. And by and large, planning departments are very good. I think the biggest problem there is that they're understaffed and underpaid. But we'll get onto that because the government is announcing the new NPPF, and there's all sorts of lovely changes that's being promised there. And then you've got your planners, and they go out to all their statutory consultees who studied for years, who's got a huge amount of experience, to assess that plan that you've made. They then write a report with a recommendation. And then the irony of the system is that it's then handed to a group of people who live in 4-year cycles, called councillors, politicians, who maybe had half an hour, maybe they pushed 2 hours of training. And, some of them over years might have built up some experience, but, you've got to start somewhere. And, especially we've seen this a lot with administrations changing over the last 3-4 years, dramatic changes to councils, where you'd have a planning committee that's completely new. And they've never sat on planning committees.
Oh, absolutely. I can tell you stories about schemes that have been, negotiated for, 3 years, worked closely with local authorities, recommended for approval, great scheme, everyone likes it. But then of course the council changes and all of that is literally down the drain in a week.
Yes.
I mean, interesting, an obvious little point for anyone that doesn't realise, you don't want to be going to planning committee any time near an election.
Oh, absolutely.
By the way.
Yeah. No, I mean, that really is something, and we are very strict on that. I really do advise our clients, do not, under any circumstances, go and put yourself in the middle of a political battle, until there is guidance that says, thou shalt not negatively campaign on housing, and you will only do positive campaigning. Until that point, just stay away from elections, because you will paint a big red dot on your forehead as a target. And also if you work with councillors beforehand and with communities, you can actually turn it into a positive, but that takes a long time to get there. Don't think that you're going to walk in with next year on the elections, the county council elections, and some unitaries are on the 1st of May. Don't think you can make friends with them in March, launch your consultation and submit in April, because you will be the front page news.
Yeah.
So, just leave off.
Answer me this, Henry. So, as we've touched upon, there's at the moment generally not a lot of votes in being pro-development and pro-housing, as in general. I mean, that needs to change, but certainly down at a local level where people are most directly affected. NIMBYs, lots of people don't want anything where they realise there's a big need for housing, but it needs to be somewhere else, not where they live, right? And as a result, there's not a load of votes in housing. Certainly locally. So you can definitely see why, councillors and people on planning committees take the easy option of deferring applications, kicking the can down the road, refusing things based on the fact that, even if it was recommended for approval, if and when the planning inspectorate approves it, then at least I can put my hands up and say, oh, well, it's nothing to do with me. It was that nasty government, those nasty planners that let it happen.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Some councillors do take that view, but that's councillors is not very good in my opinion. I can tell you that I use it to my advantage. There's this thing called Section 106, and that provides infrastructure funding and infrastructure works, and that's the stuff that needs to happen. And what I find bizarre is that so many people kind of look at 106 when you start talking to the councillors. You start talking about Section 106, and there's complete bewilderment, like it's the first time they've heard of this, which is just bizarre. I mean, and I used it. I spoke to the developers, and I made it very clear of what my community needed. This is how I got a larger GP surgery. This is how I got my community library, how I got my new community hall, how I got my school enlarged. And these are things that I stood on because I was very proud of what I had achieved in that local area. And this was on my newsletters, and I'm very glad to say that the first time I got elected, my majority wasn't very big in the, after the first term, my majority was much bigger because I went out there and I negotiated these things, and then trumpeted them because I had achieved that. And every councillor across this country should be doing that, should be working with the developers to actually deliver the infrastructure that's meaningful and what your community wants. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that and engaging with developers, and I can tell you that I worked with these developers and I said, there was one specific development that I got everything that I wanted, but I still had a fundamental problem with the development and I still voted against it. But I was pragmatic and I actually got what I wanted from this, because if it happens, and inevitably sometimes it's going to happen, if it's technically compliant, you can, of course, vote it down at the local council, but the inspector could look at it and go, well, this is what should happen. And you have a duty to make sure that if that happens, even if you are against it, that part of it is actually done, so that if it happens, that it is actually going to work for your community. You have a duty to do that. And a lot of people just don't seem to realise that, which is a great shame. And I hope that, from what we do, I hope that councillors do actually pick up on that. And there are councillors that are very good at that and pick up on these things when you start talking to them and bringing their attention to it.
Yeah. So I think there's obviously a massive education piece required for councillors. Obviously understanding planning in general, but also land economics and viability, and the fact that someone needs to be financially incentivized to do the hard work to make things happen.
Yes.
Unless you're lucky enough to have free or subsidized land. But even then, it's super difficult. You talk about estate regeneration. I mean, I've done those. You've done those. Talk about difficult and hard work. I mean, none of this stuff is easy. So local councillors definitely need to be educated in planning, land economics, viability, and also how and why this. We all, hopefully everyone realises there's a massive need for housing, right? You'd have to be pretty stupid. Well, actually, let's jump onto that, because there are, amazingly, now and then, I do see articles and people saying there isn't a housing problem. I mean, what's all that about?
I mean, it must be people that live under rocks. I can't think of anything else. There's been some fallacies. I think one of my favourite lines, something has died down now, but certainly after the referendum, you had it quite often saying, we voted for Brexit, so we're not going to have any immigrants now, and it's only the immigrants that need these houses. Well, actually, no, we've got a growing population, and an ageing population, and yes, we still need the houses, and anybody with any common sense that's ever spoken to anybody under the age of 45 will know the struggle of finding a house, and if you can find one, how can you find one that you can afford? We've got mortgages that's needed that's 5, 6, 7, 8 times the income. How on earth do you service that sort of mortgage? And it's a very simple question of supply and demand. If the demand outstrips the supply price is going to go up. And yes, 1.5 million will house prices come down? Well, I hope they will. You can't make guarantees because the crisis is so vast, and overcrowding in some places is so horrendous that it will take years. It's going to take years to address this.
Yeah. Tell me, other than the things we've touched upon, because and in fact we'll probably finish off talking about the consultation around planning committees, because it's looking like they could start getting bypassed a bit more. But before we come on to that, what else? Obviously votes, but what do you think is it that makes some councillors just? I'm trying not to say thick. Do you know the thing is? I've got to tell you, and most people won't say that, but Jesus, some of the morons I've seen on planning committees, I mean, like literally off the scale, right? So, I mean, that's a whole another question about how certain people should even be allowed on committees. But what makes some of them so just anti-development and head in the sand? I don't know. I mean, I realise everyone's different and we've all got different opinions, but
some people are obviously motivated, and this is particularly a problem in some quarters with the independents got elected, specifically on anti-development tickets, and there's in the parties also that, and I think it comes again down to I dare say selfishness. I've got a house, I'm all right, mate. I don't care about anybody else, and if there's houses built here, it's going to ruin my view. I mean, we recently had, it was a site, and there was a genuine objection where somebody wrote in and said, I'm against this development because it will ruin the view from my kitchen. Well, love, go and sit in the living room, or in your dining room if you want to have that view. Really, truly, and honestly, being against development because it's going to ruin the view out of your kitchen window. How selfish can you be? I mean, I think there's a lot of that. It's going to ruin our local area. But yes, but your house was a field once upon a time, and it ruined the people who lived in the area that was developed beforehand, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, and you always find this with larger developments when you do the reserve matters, which incidentally, the indications are that they're not going to be taken away from planning committees under the drafts that I've seen, certainly. It's always phase one that objects to phase two, and phase 2 to 3, and you just think, well, if you bought this house on phase 1 and you looked at all the sales material, surely you realize that there's going to be houses built further down. So it is just educating them and trying to get past that mindset of being selfish. And it really is just horrendous how some people are just so incredibly selfish. I've got a house, so I don't care about anybody else. And they
really
don't think about their children
very often. And I should add, because I'm sure there'll be people like kicking off about me calling planning committee members thick, but there are a lot of thick planning committee members in my experience.
Do you know, I will disagree with you on this one and say I don't think they're thick. They're just uneducated. And one of the things that the government is now proposing, and I think it's in the planning and infrastructure bill, is compulsory training for planning committee members. And I think it doesn't go far enough. I think it shouldn't just be training for planning committee members. It should also be accredited. And if you don't pass the accreditation, you will not sit on the planning committee.
I think that's a fantastic idea.
And also, some of these planning committees are just a bit too big. I mean, there's one particular council that the planning committee is the entire council. You just think, how can you even function like this? Your standard planning committee is usually between 9 and 15 members, something like that. And I think even that's too big. Do you really need all those councillors to come and make a decision on this? You can still maintain that democratic input by having 5, 7 councillors that are actually trained, educated in planning, and can actually make informed decisions. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that the planning committee should be scrapped, but they definitely should be trained. And on that point, I mean, it is very interesting to note that there's part of the planning and regeneration bill. There's 11 questions that's being posed, and 3 of them are about the reform of planning committees. So what's being suggested, the NPPF is that councils will be put on a very strict timeline to produce a local plan. You must have a local plan. This is what Angela Rayner is saying. NPPF is coming out today, and it will be saying you will be given so much time to do a local plan, and the local plan will achieve all these things. And one of the things that they're looking at, one of the options is to say, well, if a site is allocated in a local plan, that site will then effectively benefit from outline planning permission. And then, the reserve matters will be sorted out because, that's just how it will work. Obviously the designs and the finer details will still be subject to separate planning applications, from what I understand. And I think it's very important that we, start with a reality check about this. If that, whether we like it or not, the democratic process has been embedded in our planning system, and there's no way of coming back from that. You can't take votes away from somebody because that becomes then an autocracy or a dictatorial system. Once the genie is out of the bottle, it's not going back in. So what will happen is I think that the local planning process will become a lot more political, and people will have to be on the front foot. If you've got a strategic site that you want to get into that local plan, you are going to have to treat that local plan process like a planning committee, because the locals will want to have a say, and that's just the way it's going to work. You can't get away from that. The other options is kind of, for a system of complete delegation, then kind of a hybrid system where, certain sites will be determined by planning officers and Whitehall officials, and some of them will go to locals, and it's all quite complicated and a bit convoluted still. There needs to be clarity, but there's some early signs of consultation on that. That's also the consultation that says that council members who sit on the planning committee must be trained properly, and then the list carries on with all these sorts of things. So local democracy is not going to vanish from the planning process, despite the best hopes of some people. We have seen evidence of the government intervening. 8,500 houses in Swale, that of course was called in by Angela Rayner 3 hours before it was going to a planning committee with a recommendation for refusal. So that's very interesting. And we have had a lot of questions after that about smaller sites. And, well, again, I'm afraid that if all planning decisions are called in by the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennycook will be doing absolutely nothing else, and they'll be working 24-hour shifts to determine all the planning applications. So it really only will be these really big things, strategic sites for very large numbers of houses, new settlements, which brings us on to the New Towns Task Force. That's the deadline for that is tomorrow, 13th. And they're going to allocate these new towns. It's very interesting to see the approach with that. It's an evolving thing. The government, of course, promised this. And they are now working very much on this to identify these sites. And, these new towns aren't necessarily going to be completely new settlements. It's not necessarily going to be just kind of, there was a green field there, let's build a new town. The reality is with that is that that's going to take a long time to deliver. Yes, it will contribute to housing numbers, but the reality is it's going to be not in this parliament. There are things that will be able to be delivered in this parliament, but that's not one of them. What the New Towns Commission is also looking at is actually taking existing settlements and adding new towns. And there's a very interesting article this morning actually about an idea that there should be a new town in London. Now, when I was a councillor, we worked on a very large scheme called Meridian Water. It's up in Enfield. And that's 12,500 homes. And that process started in the late 2000s. And it's now 15 years later. And yeah, it's starting to come out of the ground. it takes a long time. But to get back to the point about new towns, so a new town is not necessarily a new town in the middle of the countryside. It can also be significant extensions to other new settlements. Milton Keynes, I know, is in the market for this, and a remarkable leader with a remarkable team around him there, Pete Marland, who is very passionate about bringing a mass rapid transport system in, and they are very realistic. Something's got to pay for this, and if you're going to put this very expensive infrastructure in, you've got to have the critical mass to use it and pay for it in the long term. They are looking at vast numbers of houses and growing Milton Keynes, dramatically outside of his boundaries into Buckinghamshire and places like that. And that's real vision. That you have to look at that and just admire the leadership there and the vision of providing this major settlement, this major city. You've got East-West Rail that's going to go through there from the Cambridge-Oxford rail that's going to go through there, that's now been revived again, with the high-speed rail links going through there. It's really an ideal place to do these things. But that's not the only answer. These things aren't the only answer. Local plans will be made, and local communities will have to take some more housing and grow to be sustainable. I always find it very ironic, especially when you go to smaller communities, and in the days of drop-ins and things like that. And we haven't got any facilities. Our pub is closing, and the post office closed, and the local shop closed, and everything. How are we going to cope with all these people? Well, actually, it's not that difficult to understand. If there's more people that have children to go to the school, that can use the post office, can use the local shop, that can go to the pub, these things will survive, And you ask the people, when was the last time you actually used the pub that you're so worried about, or the library you're so worried about, and they have to stand there and go, it was about, was it now 8 years? And you just think, well, don't complain then, just start getting some tied up thinking.
Yeah, it's tricky. What do you think could help? Because you're right, new towns, yeah, great, fantastic, but they take a long time to get to happen. And as a general rule, it's only going to be big, massive developers that can do that stuff and make it happen. I think we may need many more smaller developers like we used to have 40, 50 years
Absolutely.
ago. And of course, they're not going to be doing that stuff. 2, 5, 20, 50 home sites, I think, can actually be better in a lot of ways, because, some of the very, very best developers are the smaller ones that they just do. It's not production line stuff. There's the reason big developers have to do things the way they do them, albeit it could be a lot better, and some of them are good. But in my opinion, small developers do tend to build better houses.
Yes.
For all sorts of reasons. What could happen to help those more?
Well, again, you're absolutely right, of course, and what happens with the bigger developments is that, of course, it comes with that infrastructure, local centre, and, parks and play areas and improvements to roads and things like that, money for improvements to public transport, and sometimes even establishing that. And that's a very different animal. And they will always be there, and they'll be in the forefront of the local plans and things like that. What would be quite good is if some of those parcels are then chopped up a little bit, and some of the smaller developers can come in. And that, of course, is something that already happens in many places. And that's something that I think needs to be maintained and encouraged. And, it could almost, dare say, be conditioned at times that, there's going to be something for the smaller developers. Every big developer started as a small developer. I'm sure George Wimpey didn't start out by building 5,000 houses the first time he built houses. He started with something small. Tony Pinchley, started with I think his famous story is he started with a wheelbarrow and a couple of bricks, and turned it into Barclay, which is this world-class, fantastic company.
Yeah.
So yes, everybody needs to start somewhere, and I think we need to encourage that because a lot of them has gone away. Where I really see them benefiting is, and these small developers can really give that attention and that care to local communities. And if a local community, a little town, a little village, were to work with them and actually embrace that and say, well, you know what? Yes, our pub is struggling, our shop's closed, if we had a few more people, be realistic about it and work with the developers, and you can get something that's going to work with your community. I can give you so many examples of where we've worked with communities and work that sort of thing up, where it contributes to that community, makes that community more sustainable, and actually provide that housing for people to come and live in those communities. You just have to sometimes say to people, you move to this community. Don't you want your children, your grandchildren to move to this community? Your friends. There's nowhere for them to live in this community. Don't you want to bring new friends into this community? It's changing that mindset. And, it'd be quite nice if the press also just sometimes publish some nice articles about development, rather than always perpetuating the message. The one that's really guilty of this, I'm afraid, is the Daily Mail. They're always, and a lot of the local papers, yes, I get it. Good news doesn't sell papers. Bad news sells papers. Yes, I get that. But, there should also be a bit of a responsibility there to say that, house building is a good thing. It helps communities. And that's where these small and medium-sized developers need to come in. And what I quite like to do is actually give a human face to it. With these developments. And when we do the consultations, we would actually have that house builder and we would show the product. This is the wonderful thing of online consultation. We can take them on a site visit. We can take them to the show home. That's maybe a little distance away. People aren't going to drive en masse to go and see this, but we can take it to them at a convenient time for them and show them what these small and medium developers can do. It's my sweet spot is those small and medium developers, to show the quality and how that can contribute to these development, these smaller settlements, and actually make them really vibrant. But also in the bigger places, there's a place for them, and they should be encouraged. They really, really, really should be encouraged.
Yeah, I agree. That's my sort of like main little thing I'm particularly keen on, because they can create better stuff. They do create better stuff. Hopefully, they are more embedded and hopefully caring about the communities that they help build and regenerate and create. Yeah, I definitely agree on the whole SME developers thing. Have you got any good examples of stuff that you might have done with some smaller developers?
So many. As I say, they really are, for me, a sweet spot. I love working with big PLC companies. They are a very different animal. And I almost sometimes see the SMEs as my kind of little pet project, my little hobby, almost. Because I think they do such a fantastic job. And yes, I can give you some really good examples. There's one specific one that I will mention, which is a developer called Osprey Homes. It's run by a wonderful chap called Bob Parker. And Bob's been in the industry for many years. And we worked with Bob on a site in Hertfordshire. And,
who's the local authority?
North Hertfordshire District Council.
Right, okay, yeah.
And it was just on the south of Hitchin, between Hitchin and a village called St. Hippolyts. And, Bob trusted us completely. And we went out there and we started to have really meaningful conversations with the local community. and really listened to them. And Bob was very responsive to that. And, we had a photograph of Bob and his family. He's got two beautiful daughters who also work in the development industry, one for him, one at another company. So it's a real family of developers, and he lives quite close by. So we went out there and put them at the forefront of this and say, we can guarantee, the Parker family's promise to you is this is going to be very high quality. And then listen to them. And it was very interesting. There was the entrance arrangement. There was a perception in the local community that there was speeding. And actually, highways engineers didn't find any evidence of this. And county highways didn't find any evidence of this. But there was a perception. So I went back to Bob and I said, look, Bob, there's a perception of speeding on this stretch of road, and what locals are asking for is a roundabout. And he said, well, okay, gosh, let me go and talk to people. So he came back and he said, well, can't be a roundabout because that's far too expensive. We don't have the land ownership and things like that. But we could probably do a mini roundabout. And we actually put that in the consultation material and asked people to vote on that specific issue. And because this was a tangible benefit to the local community that this developer could deliver, a lot of people actually took part in that and actually voted on what they wanted. And they all voted, 80% of them voted for the roundabout, which is what they will now get. We did some really good engagement with the school. There's a little Church of England school in Iplitz that was going to benefit from the Section 106 to make sure that they've got a tangible thing that they can make that case for the money to come to them. And there was also a sports hall, a little clubhouse sports hall thing for the St. Iplitz, I think it's St. Iplitz United Football Club or something like that. I can't remember exactly the name now. And it was real tangible benefits that we could take back to that community because we did all the work beforehand and had all these things and then went out to the consultation and actually showed people what it's going to look like. And we had 3G kind of animated almost CGIs to show people, drive through the development and show people what it's going to look like. And, this site was a draft allocation. It was before the local plan was adopted.
How many homes on that one?
84.
Okay.
So, this is kind of medium.
Yeah.
We've done on smaller things as well. There's another one we got through for him for 9 houses that actually facilitated a village green also in Hertfordshire. So really responsive, really responsible developer that really engaged with the communities, and I'll never forget it. We actually went out during right at the tail end of the pandemic and kind of had a meeting where, we met with the residents about the local concerns. And we all stood, our 2 meters apart with our masks and things on. But we did make that effort to go out and go and see them. And it was actually the decision maker that went there. Bob actually went there himself, listened to these people. And one of the concerns of these particular residents were that, overlooking. And he said, well, that's fine. I know that your preference is that you wouldn't necessarily want the houses because, fine, we accept that. What can we do to mitigate this? And they said, well, we want to have some trees planted there. And what happened then was, I think it was laurels that was planted at a certain size. And, we actually worked with the residents. And as far as I know, these residents are still looking after these laurel trees and watering them for us when they need watering and things like that, because it's their trees that was planted to help with the screening. And it became theirs to look after and form that ownership of this benefit to them. When this came to the planning committee, I off the top of my head, I think it was about 8 months before the plan was actually adopted. So it was just a draft allocation. That was Greenbelt. Met very special circumstances with community infrastructure. And yes, got a unanimous consent, which really demonstrates, if the smaller developers, but this was really early, the residents heard about this from us. And we had beforehand worked up this message, this positive message of these are all the good things this development's going to do for your community. Sincere things, not second guessing it. Oh, policy says you will like, a play area. No, actually, what do you actually want? And we had that as the messaging. So, smaller developers are more agile with that. So we really like working with them and getting that message out there. And I do feel very personally involved with those developers, and they become very good friends. Not that the PLCs don't. There's a lot of very good people at the PLCs, but they are more restricted in what they can do, and how they can engage. And it's also much bigger developments. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. Important message there is for communities and councillors and people making planning decisions is that, we need housing, obviously. It's got to go somewhere. And there are, massive benefits to be had for the communities. The obvious ones, Section 106 stuff to, mitigate any negative impacts and actually provide good stuff as well. And of course, CIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, pretty much everywhere now. So, I don't think you said it yourself earlier on, that, even some committee members don't realise that there is big chunks of value, both obvious and also perhaps a bit less tangible, that are to be had from encouraging good development.
You have to pay the Section 106. Make sure that it actually delivers tangible benefits for that community, because that's how you are going to convince them that what you are planning to do is good for their communities and make their lives better. And that's what people care about, and if you can get to that point, that's really good. And, and I have had people say, aren't you bribing communities? No, the 106 is going to get paid, whether you like it or not, and there's two ways of doing this. The 106 could either go into some, black hole, the council, and be used for something that may or may not benefit the community. And if it does, unless people actually know that the 106 has been paid and it has provided that, you're not going to get the benefit. So if you really do care, do work on that and actually make sure that 106 works for you. Put tangible benefits in, because that's how you get your communities on side.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Right. Thanks for coming, Henry.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together we can all help create better places, spaces and homes, and a much more beautiful world.